Alrighty. Hello, hello. Thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. Enjoy as much Jimmy John's as, hey Jake, how you doing? Enjoy as much Jimmy John's or soda as you want. Sponsored by Coca-Cola. So this is our presentation on a trip that the Clemency Clinic took to Norway. So we spent about a week there. We did a variety of things, the most important of which visited Halden prison, but we also went to Parliament and a variety of other spaces and places regarding the criminal justice system. So just to start off, I'd like to introduce a guest speaker we have here, Ivan Heiberg. He is the Royal Norwegian Consulate General, and he's the one that's responsible for having our visit to Parliament, which was very, very exciting. He was a CEO at Sons of Norway for 11 years, which is a life insurance company in Norway. He actually got his master's in speech communication at the U, so he's also a gopher. And as in his position as a consulate general, he essentially represents the King and the Kingdom of Norway with the Midwest, specifically Minnesota. And we are so thankful for his ability to set up a meeting with Parliament. We'd like to bring him on to say a few words.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I am super excited to be here. This is a lot of fun, and thank you, Professor Murray, for connecting and reaching out prior to the visit. And you know, this is kind of part of the work we do at the Norwegian Consulate, really help connect and assist U.S. Especially here in Minnesota, the bilateral relationship we have, with Minnesota and with the U.S. is really fantastic. So I was just excited to be able to participate and play a tiny role in the visit that you all made to Norway. So thank you again for the invitation to be here and see the presentation firsthand. So, and it's a little interesting, ironic maybe in some ways that we're here at the Walter Mondale Hall and Law School as well, because Mondale was actually my predecessor as Honor Consul General. So fantastic man, and he was very generous with his time when it came to Norway and all the high-level visits we had from Norway visiting Minnesota. So that's fantastic. But I'm super excited to actually see this presentation and hear your perspective, from the U.S. and your mindset of what the legal and criminal justice system is like in Norway. And Halden prison is actually the prison located in my hometown where I was born and raised as well. And I think many of you probably have read about this prison. It's been in Time Magazine, New York Times. I mean, it's been in just about any publication, I think, around the world, frankly, talking about the more modernized type of a prison environment and how they run things. So I'm super excited to see that. I know you weren't able and didn't have time to see all the great things that Halden had to offer, including this. I'm a little subjective in this, but the best really fortress in all of Norway, but you got a chance to see another great one in Oslo, I understand. So that's fantastic. And you frankly met one of my college roommates. When you met with members of the Parliament, so and one who's very engaging. So I can't wait to hear more about how that session went as well. So again, thank you for inviting me. I am very, very excited to be here for the presentation, and I'll turn it back over to you folks. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much. Also, in terms of questions, we'll love to field questions at the end, but if you're shy, you could just send an email to me right there and we can just have the questions sent through that way. So thank you so much. So I'm gonna provide a very general overview, and you're gonna see a lot of the other students in the clinic. They're gonna take on very specific issues, women's prisons, immigration, politics, solitary confinement, just a variety of issues we learned about. So just to start off, we're gonna talk about Halden, which was mentioned as the most humane prison in the world. And we're gonna look at a couple photos to really see the stark contrast between American prisons and Norwegian prisons. So just at a general sense, this is kind of the general living quarters areas in which the inmates are allowed to be in. It seems this is a maximum security prison that they send the worst of the worst murderers, sexual offenders, and and this is kind of the treatment that they're provided and they're given. So it's generally just, it looks like a very laid back area. They actually don't spend tons of time within this area specifically. It's just for dinners and gatherings, because they do get a lot of opportunities in terms of working and vocational training that prepares them for reintegration in society. So to look into their cells, they actually get individualized rooms. Unfortunately, we couldn't provide pictures of what they look like once they are able to decorate it. Very personalized, very kind of homish. Because of privacy concerns, we weren't able to record that. But here's just a general picture of what it looks like. As you can see, they actually get a nice window view into the rest of the prison, which has a bunch of green areas and spaces and artwork. They actually get their own bathrooms that they're able to go in and out of with themselves. Showers, toilets, and everything. So there's no communal showering or bathroom spaces. And you could see they get TVs, which they're able to access and use. They're able to rent, movies and videos, and kind of when they spend the time here and not at work, it really feels like they're coming home. And I think one of the most shocking things is they actually have a door. It's not like in American-style prison where it's two people within a room and then a space that is either open or shut, depending on what the guards want. You're able to go in and out of it, except during night, in which they kind of close the doors and you are kept in until the morning time. And the other thing I found really interesting is they actually have communal areas for when they have visits from family, and whether that's your significant other. I mean, this is a men's prison, so it'd be women coming in or children coming in so they could spend time with their families. So just to provide a very brief overview of kind of the motivating principles behind this very humane prison, there's 4 motivating principles. You have the normality principle, the import model, the reintegration work, and the dynamic security. So I think the most important thing they really talk about is the normality principle, which is making life within prison as similar to life outside of prison. And there's a variety of reasons they do so. Whether that's because they view prisoners or incarcerated individuals as people that are their neighbors, are also very similar, that they could be in very similar situations once they exit society, unlike American institutions where people that go in prisons often are segregated to different parts of the world. This is really the reality of we're putting a person in prison, and how we treat them is going to affect how they behave outside of it, and it's going to be consequences for me. So yeah, they get to work and they get to buy their own food. They get to have their own space. So that's really a motivating principle there. The second thing that's really interesting is something called the import model. So there's no private, there's not a private transaction between a company or corporation or government actor that specifically just provides all the services to the prison. The municipality and the local government are the ones that provide those services. So when you think of healthcare, dental, education, psychiatric care, that is either the city of Halden, or Norway's larger government providing those services. And a motivating factor behind that is they believe that you have rights as an individual citizen of Norway that don't get removed once you get into prison. So the same social welfare rates that you'd get on the outside, you still get on the inside. So there's not a disparity of care services in that respect. Next is something they've focused very heavily on, which is rehabilitation and reintegration into society. Norwegian prisons didn't always used to be like this. Previously, they had very high recidivism rates. Prisons were not unlike American prisons in terms of jam-packing a bunch of people into one space, and they reimagined how they were going to kind of handle and deal with these issues. And a big one was going to be creating a prison system that works to rehabilitate and reintegrate people into society. And the last thing, which Ben will talk about a little bit, is an idea of dynamic security. So it goes beyond simply having prison guards, monitor incarcerated people as violent cattle that you kind of just herd and you take care of from a distance. It's really transforming the guard's role to one of a social worker. The idea being, if you can have an actual relationship with prisoners, it's easier to spot not only safety concerns, but make their goal and their path to reintegration a lot more successful. So from there, I'll pass it on to Ben.
Okay, so Victor did talk a little bit about normality, but I'll cover it a little bit more in depth, not really anything crazy. But like he said, what kind of neighbor do you want? So as you'll see later, Norway has really short sentences. So these are individuals that will come back out into the world relatively quickly, especially as compared to the United States. So this kind of idea of, you saw they live in kind of almost a studio apartment. They actually get to wear their own clothes. They wear street clothes. They don't wear a bright orange jumpsuit like you might see in America. And the reality is that they're just treated as normal people. The only rights that are restricted is your liberty. Everything else just remains the same. So kind of a really fascinating idea to kind of treat these people as people like they should be. More interestingly is this principle of dynamic security. And this is probably the biggest key to me as to what makes Norwegian prisons so successful. So like Victor said, guard is social workers. So when you sign up to be a prison officer in Norway, you go through 2 years of education. So it's all paid for, but before you ever see an inmate, you have to go through this kind of 2-year training. And what you're trained in is everything from psychology, criminology, law, so you can better understand that sentencing and things like that. You learn about human rights, ethics, this whole gambit of everything that you would need to learn to take care of an inmate properly. Just for some context, in America, that's usually a 6-week course where the majority of what you learn is just how to operate inside of the prison. So going a little bit deeper, this whole idea is dynamic security is creating these interpersonal relationships with each individual inmate, right? So you're not just a guard. When you think about static security, you think about everything that's physical, everything in America that, the bars, the wires, everything that makes a prison kind of scary from the outside view. But what you do also have is this static supervision where guards are sitting behind cameras. They're not in the units. They're behind the cameras watching these individuals. And America's model or system is basically predicated on the idea that if you stay away, there won't be as much violence against the officers, right? So maintain a distance, supervise, keep the violence low. But in Norway, the idea is to create relationships, get closer to the inmates, understand them as people, and that in and of itself will create the relationship where the violence will just be low because you're not going to probably attack someone that you have a daily interaction with that you would consider a friend in some circumstances. The other thing that was striking is when you move around the prison in Norway, you just walk with an officer. Again, you're in your street clothes. It just looks like 2 people walking down the street. Whereas in America, you're probably moved around in cuffs. So again, this kind of physical restraint versus this freedom because you've built that relationship. Another thing that the officers do is they're considered a contact officer. So they'll take 2 to 3 inmates and based on all the experience that they learned and grew on in their 2 years of training, they'll work on treatment plans, they'll do rehabilitation, they'll provide a future plan so that when these individuals get out, they know what they're gonna do and they can go out into the world as a citizen, going back to that idea that they will be your neighbor. And Norway's population is roughly the size of Minnesota, so if you think about the prison population, they actually will just go out and most likely live in the same neighborhood or same town as you. So these are kind of these big ticket ideas. In America, it's been tried in just a select few areas. North Dakota and Oregon specifically are really trying to develop this dynamic security idea. And what they've seen is exactly what you would expect, this reduced recidivism rate, which is huge, obviously, also a big problem in America, but also the decrease in violent incidents. And if you're thinking about safety inside of a prison, the American model of stepping back doesn't necessarily work when you think about how successful it could be if you were to just create a relationship with a prisoner and treat them as a human being instead of just kind of herding cattle. So that's my piece.
All right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what this model looks like in practice, what life is actually like inside Halden prison, and Victor covered the housing situation a little bit. So as you can see, just like a normal bedroom, dorm style, it really kind of did feel like a college dorm when you went in. When we walked into the housing unit, there was one inmate there who came up and offered us baked goods to welcome us into like their housing. And it was really just strange to have someone who is incarcerated, but is really just there like a normal person and was welcome to have guests and was excited to see people there who were interested in it. You can see they have a TV, they watch, soccer games, they eat meals together. They've got, usually I think one inmate will cook a meal for them each night and they eat it just like a family meal every night, and it really helps to build that community into the prison block. In terms of vocational training, as part of the import model, they're bringing in these teachers who are essentially public school teachers who will come in and give them all the training they need to succeed, where they're working as someone would in the United States, except when they leave, they'll be fully accredited to work in any of the industries they choose to go into. So here they have a full body shop, a metal shop, a woodworking shop. As you can see just by the tools on the wall, these were unrestricted. There's no locks on a big wrench or a big hammer that would never be allowed anywhere near inmates in a US prison without strict supervision. But here you're just given free rein to make your projects. One interesting thing about the auto body shop was that they also provide services to the community of Halden. So the cars they're working on are people who are coming to the prison to get their cars worked on as part of a service to the community. Let's see. They also, it's not just like industrial jobs, they also had a full restaurant, functioned like any normal restaurant. You could work as a waiter, work as a chef. They provide meals to the prison staff and members of the community. They have every type of tool you can imagine. So they had full CNC machines, laser cutting, 3D printers, lathes, and it's just goes to the point that when they leave, they'll be prepared to work in any industry that they desire to. One last point about that was they also do get paid for the work. They'll make around $8 a day, which does not seem like much, but compared to prison wages in the US, it's a really significant jumping off point. In terms of recreation in the living areas, they do have a full grocery store, which was as well stocked as any like small market you would find in the US. They're free to cook their own meals if they'd like to, take food back to their rooms. They have mini fridges that can keep perishable foods good for longer. They also have a library that is just a public library. It has everything available that you could find in any public library outside of the prison, including like a full host of movies to watch on the TVs they have in their rooms. And then they have a full gym, a full basketball court, soccer pitch, a full room for recreation. They said that allowing the time to go to the gym and just play recreational sports is one of the like most important factors they have in like keeping everyone really well satisfied and happy in building relationships. All right.
All right, so if you've heard all of this so far, you might be wondering, what would it actually look like to apply some of these principles from the Nordic model in the United States? That's what I'm going to be talking about. There's a few objections you usually hear. One very common one I know I've heard from friends and family here is that this is great, but Norway, it's a wealthy country, it's a ethnically homogenous country. It wouldn't work in a country as big and diverse as the United States. This may not be a great thing for Norway, but about 40% of their prisoners in the maximum security facilities there are immigrants, many of them from Somalia, quite a few from Eastern European countries as well. They're becoming a more diverse country, demographically fairly similar to the state of Minnesota, actually. So I wouldn't say it's true that, you know, this is all white people. And if it was, I don't think that would be a salient point. Second is that the U.S. is a much more violent country. We have gangs. You need stricter security measures to keep them in check in prisons. That may be true up to a point, but as we've seen, their dynamic security has actually been helpful in reducing violence in a few cases where it's been applied in the United States. That has been the case. Third is the cost. This actually isn't true at all. I don't think anyone's touched on price yet, but for a maximum security facility like Halden Prison, they spend $130,000 per year per inmate. Minimum security facility is $70,000 and probation's about $15,000. This is a lot more than we spend in the US, but their recidivism rate is 3 times lower. Theirs is 25%, ours is about 75%. And in general, their incarceration rate overall is about 10 times lower than the United States per capita, which means even if they're spending 4 or 5 times more per prisoner, if you're incarcerating 10 times fewer people, you can do the math and see it's actually not more expensive at all. There's a few existing experiments in the US. North Dakota has tried this at the Missouri River Correctional Center. Some of their legislators visited Halden Prison and explicitly modeled one of their minimum security facilities off of it. They have a program there where you get to have a service dog, and they can also become certified in training service dogs. It's been very popular at that prison. One difference I would note in the North Dakota experiment is that this is a minimum security facility as opposed to a maximum security facility like Halden. So their results are bound to be a little bit better based off who their inmates are. Although I would note they've also reformed their maximum security prisons in North Dakota. I think most importantly, they had a very awful segregation unit. A large percentage of their inmates spent a lot of time in solitary confinement, and they replaced that with what they call the behavioral intervention program, more based off the solitary confinement they have in Norway, which is very, very limited, and they've seen good results in North Dakota. We also talked with a delegation from Pennsylvania. They opened up a section of their prison called Little Scandinavia. It's very much based off Halden. Rooms, fish tanks, as you can see on the screen. It's been a short-lived experiment. It really just got going after COVID kind of died down, but it's been successful so far. There's been no violent incidents. They have a good staff to inmate ratio, 1:8. Halden actually has more staff than they do inmates. It's not quite that, but compared to a typical American prison, it's very humane and it's seen good results. Potential obstacles, political cowardice. No one wants to stick their neck out for prisoners, which is a constituency that doesn't have much power in this country. Also, there's always the concerns about cost and the simple fact that their prison system is supported by a very supportive welfare state. They get public housing accommodations, universal health care, universal education. They can pay for 2 years of college for all their corrections officers, and that's a pretty stark difference between us and Norway. But the case is pretty simple. Treating inmates better is good in itself. It's a good enough reason as far as I'm concerned, but there's also safer prisons for inmates and guards, better morale, less turnover. In the long run, it'll cost less, and their crime rate's pretty low and their recidivism rate's low. So I think those are all good reasons to do it. The last thing I'll note before I move on is that the places that have adopted Norwegian-style corrections in the United States aren't necessarily the places you would think. North Dakota, Pennsylvania, I guess Oregon. I mean, this isn't exactly just loony blue state stuff. It's for everyone. We've been able to get broad coalition of people on board with this, and I think that's an encouraging sign. So on that note, we will move on to Amy.
All right. So far we've talked mainly about Halden, which is an all-male prison. And while we didn't visit any other prisons in Norway, and we didn't visit any women's facilities specifically, we did hear a bit about what it is like for women in prison in Norway. So this is something we heard from a couple of different people we met with, is that women have equal rights everywhere in Norway except in prison. Yeah. So there's a lot less women in prison in Norway. I think it's somewhere less than like 300, somewhere like 275 women total in prison. And I believe there's only like one dedicated women's prison. Yeah, so the women themselves in prison, because there's so fewer, like they tend to have higher rates of substance abuse, higher rates of like mental health problems, higher rates of prior abuse, and then they're convicted of more serious crimes as well. And this isn't like dissimilar than the US. There's a lot less women in prison in the US as well. It has like exploded more so in recent decades, but typically women in prison in Norway and the US have a higher rates of different issues coming into their incarceration. And so the prisons themselves, as I mentioned, I believe there's only one like dedicated women's prison. There might be a couple more that have opened in the last few years, but that leads to a lot of the women being housed within men's facilities. And so they're typically housed in like the older buildings. They have less access to outdoor space, less access to programming. And something else that I saw too was that they're often the first group like locked up when there's less guards on duty. So if a bunch of guards call out sick one day and they don't have enough guards to kind of watch all of the prisoners, they just will leave the women locked up because that's, the first unit that will suffer as a result of that. And so, yeah, and then they may also be placed in higher security prisons just for no other reason than that there's less space. And so that's just a picture I found of the women's exercise yard at a prison that they share with men. And so just most of this information I found off of the Norwegian Parliamentary Ombud. Y'all know how to pronounce that word. They have a report on women in prison. So if you want more information on that, that gives a really good summary.
So as you can see, right now we're looking a little bit more critically at the Norwegian prison system, and right now we're going to see a presentation by one of the other clemency students that couldn't be here, Bethany, and she's going to talk about specifically one of the main issues regarding Norwegian prisons, which is solitary confinement.
So let's make sure the video works.
Hi, my name is Bethany. I am not able to be there in person today, but I am just going to talk a little bit about what we learned about solitary confinement in Norway. So primarily, Norway claims to not use solitary confinement for punishment, but really only to de-escalate situations or when there's a safety concern, especially a safety concern for the person who they're using solitary confinement on. We were told by the governor of Halden that it's only been used a handful of times since he's been there, and for a very short amount of time each time that it's been used. However, some of the people we met with, such as defense attorneys, kind of questioned that statement. And we also heard about a couple of ombudsman reports that have sort of criticized Norway for its use of solitary confinement, claiming that they use it excessively and that it's in violation of human rights. One of those reports was in 2019, and then another one actually just came out right before we had went to Norway. So one of the main uses of solitary confinement is when someone is awaiting their trial. Norwegians have this sort of fear that if a person is allowed to be with the rest of the population in the prison or in a jail, that it will sort of infect their testimony, or it could contaminate the evidence in the case. So to combat that, if they are holding a person in custody awaiting their trial, that person is typically held in solitary confinement. And then after being convicted and sent to a prison, we were told that prisoners often spend weeks being separated from the rest of the population while they're being evaluated for like their risk level and what kinds of programs or what kind of situation is appropriate for them in the prison. At least at Halden prison, they had single person cells, and they were locked into their cells from 8 p.m. till 8 a.m. every day because of the lack of staff in the prison during the night. When we asked some of the staff at Halden about this, they kind of claim that Norwegians really like to be alone and it's a cultural thing and that they actually prefer it that way. Even if that is true, at about 40% of the prison population are immigrants, so it's kind of a questionable claim to make. Also, this person photographed over here who is presenting to us is a formerly incarcerated person who had been at Halden prison and had actually asked to be moved to a different prison because he would rather have a cellmate and not spend so much time alone than have kind of all of the bells and whistles that Halden offered. Here are just a couple of photos of the solitary confinement rooms at Halden. Pretty standard, not much inside. one kind of unique thing about them is that they do actually have a clock in there so someone can see how much time has gone by, which is probably a nice thing to have. And then they have these sort of ladders on the outside to look in at somebody from this window up here. I'm not quite sure. I never quite understood why they do that rather than having like a slot in the door or something to look through, but that was interesting as well. So just kind of final takeaways. Even though Norway does use less solitary confinement than the US for sure, and especially because they don't use it for punitive reasons, there's still reason to be concerned about how much it's used and kind of the circumstances it's used in, and just generally how much time prisoners in Norway spend by themselves. Thank you.
Sorry, let me just make sure this works.
Hi.
Here we go.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name's Josh. I'm actually not part of the clemency clinic. I just had the very fortunate privilege of being invited to come along on the trip because of a case that I worked on with the clemency clinic. And so thank you again to all of you for allowing me to come with. It was such an honor. But that also brings me to focus on something maybe a little bit outside of just the penal system, but also, what's unique about the Norwegian criminal justice system in general, and specifically the court system. And you'll see, and I won't editorialize too much, but there are some real similarities. There's a lot that's the same, but there's also some really interesting differences, particularly some differences that defense attorneys in particular might find interesting. So they have a pretty similar structure, 3 different kinds of courts. Of course, since they're a small country, it's basically just a federal court system. There's not like state courts as well. So this is describing the entire court system of Norway. 23 district courts and 59 court premises, like court buildings, 6 regional courts of appeal, and 1 Supreme Court. And in the district courts, there are really kind of 2 types of cases. First of all, there's like regular criminal cases, and those are tried by a professional judge and 2 lay judges, and I'll talk about what lay judges are in a moment. But there's also summary procedure cases, criminal cases, in other words, just, someone has confessed and that one's just tried by a single judge, and often, or ordinarily even, there's really no prosecutor or attorney involved once, they've confessed and basically, admitted to the crime. Now, going up to the regional court of appeal, they have 2 professional judges and 5 lay judges, and they actually, what really interesting about the appeals court is, here, of course, appellate courts are just deciding an error of the district court or deciding some kind a law, the issues of law. But in Norway, they'll actually basically retry the case, and just with a larger panel. And so that's a really interesting difference there. They actually can retry an issue of guilt and resentence. And then finally, the Supreme Court, they have 20 justices, not 9. They kind of have the same role. They'll set aside judgments for procedural errors or legal interpretations. And just one kind of side note that I thought was really interesting, very different from the United States, is that at least theoretically, I've heard that in practice this isn't exactly true, but theoretically, UN conventions and other areas of international law take precedence over even Norway's constitution. And so that's really interesting, kind of the faith in international law and tying to that the U.S. being a little more exceptionalist might not have. So I know I mentioned lay judges. There's this distinction between professional judges and lay judges, and the reason for that is there aren't any juries in Norway. There are not 12 jurors who decide issues of fact, but there are lay judges. So of course there's professional judges just like ours. They're generalists. They're nominated by an independent board, so a little bit different, not the executive, although theoretically they're also kind of commissioned by the king. And they're appointed for life, so very similar that way. But they do have an age limit. It's 70. So that's a big difference, something that I've heard proposed quite a bit for judges in the US, but probably will never happen. There's also deputy judges. This is a little bit uncommon, but those are basically people who have come right out of undergraduate studies, don't have formal legal studies, and that's kind of controversial. It's a small portion of judges, I think, just in Oslo. But I've actually heard from a lot of attorneys that they really like having these basically like unexperienced deputy judges because they have this really fresh perspective and they're looking at all the details really intensely. And so that's kind of an interesting concept. But maybe the most interesting and unique concept is the lay judges. So like I said earlier, there are 2 lay judges and 1 professional judge at the district court level. At the appellate court level, they might retry the case entirely with 5 lay judges and 2 professional judges. And those lay judges are not lawyers. They don't have a formal legal education. They're just chosen from a panel essentially the way a juror would be picked here, except for they're first nominated to this panel by political parties, and they stay on, don't quote me on this, but I think for about 4 years, where they're on this list to potentially be called, and they'll then go and try and actually sit next to the judge, the way you would see the judge kind of sit up at the raised, behind on the bench. They sit on the bench with the judge, and that's pretty interesting to see. Of course, they're highly influenced by the judge, but the 2 lay jurors could completely overrule the decision of a judge, and so that's a kind of an interesting, maybe controversial, maybe not. The other thing I'll just highlight really quickly is one thing that there's kind of a lot more of a melding between civil and criminal cases. Victims, and I think this is a recent development in Norway, that victims actually have legal representation, and so there are victim advocates in the courtroom that can actually introduce evidence, particularly, and most often evidence about damages. And so you'll see a victim's advocate actually, almost acting as a prosecutor in a criminal case, and that's pretty interesting. Another interesting point about counsel is that the defendants actually get to pick their own counsel, so they can choose anyone. It's not just from a panel of attorneys, and then the attorney they pick is just paid a standard rate by the government. And so it's not just public defender. You go pay someone. You can actually pick the attorney you want and have the government pay them. And then finally, I'll just really quickly, sentences in Norway are short. In comparison to the US, the maximum sentence for first-degree homicide is 21 years. And so that's a very big difference, and I think reflects the kind of Norwegian philosophy of, being confident that they're able to really rehabilitate and reform their prisoners.
So I'm just going to talk briefly about Norwegian politics because I think the politics of Norway really pervade the whole system, which is, first off, unsurprisingly, Norway also runs their elections better than we do. So they have region-based proportional representation, and a multitude of parties who are represented. I think most interesting to me was that the more conservative party is successful in Oslo, whereas the Labour Party is more successful in more regional parts of Norway. And then they have the Stortinget, which is their unicameral parliament. So they don't do two houses of government. And Norway currently has a minority government with the Labour Party and the Centre Party. And the Centre Party is sort of a moderate agrarian kind of nationalist party. And then also of note, you have a Progress Party. The Progress Party is Norway's far-right party, which was very confusing at first. But this all gets interesting when it comes to the politics of prison in Norway. Norway is lucky, or its prisoners have been lucky in that there's an agreement between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party broadly about protecting sort of the Scandinavian welfare system and on broad areas of Norwegian politics. And then you have, we were fortunate enough to meet with a member of the members of the Labour Party and a member of the Progress Party, and that's where you can really see the modern difference in political parties emerge, which is that the Labour Party, who is currently in government, is invested in protecting the Norwegian social safety net and the broad welfare system that includes prisoners. And the Progress Party, which sounds a lot more like the modern Republican Party, is hostility to immigrants, and an interest in lowering taxes and a disinterest in how much is ultimately being spent on prisoners and seeing these prisons as more luxurious than necessary. And what it ultimately really boiled down to was that there is an undercurrent of racism in Germany, or in Norway. And that, also true. And that in Norway, that a lot, because 40% of the prisoners are immigrants, it's an easier punching bag for the far right to say that we shouldn't be spending so much money and treating these immigrants and non-Norwegians so well.
Hello, and to everyone who knows me well, howdy. So I'm gonna play the villain here a little bit, talking about the Norwegian criminalization. So as we've kind of hit on, the population is about 5.4 million. There are roughly like 2,732 people in prison, and then about 40% of that prison population is foreigners. So, I mean, that's roughly like 0.05% of the population is incarcerated, and then 40% is foreigners. So I thought that was a very stark difference, something that I discovered and kind of wanted to investigate more. And as we asked more questions, we realized that one, they were very afraid of Sweden and how Sweden mismanaged the immigration and asylum seeking in 2015. And not wanting to do that in Norway. And then two, that they were okay with using kind of what I would describe and some professors at the University of Oslo would describe as like a two-tier criminal system where they use deportation as kind of a scapegoat of getting people out of the country so they don't go through that criminal system. So like I mentioned, Sweden has seen a massive increase in violent crimes over the last 10 years. That number of 388 shootings is like 6 times more than Norway, Denmark, and Finland combined. And that's Norway's next door neighbor. So that's very much on their mind when they're making decisions about how to deal with both immigration, but also the criminal system and the penal system altogether. interesting enough, Sweden had also done a study where about 2.5 times more likely foreigners would be suspects in crimes other than like native Swedish, the native Swedish population. That's something that we kind of started to touch on and see as we were talking with Parliament, defense attorneys, prosecutors, that there was a general kind of feeling of unsafety that was starting to build around immigration into Norway. I believe at one point in time we were speaking with a member of Parliament and they started talking about how police officers in Oslo were starting to wear guns again because of the kind of dangerous environments that were starting to pull up. So I thought that was a very interesting thing to see. It was a very common theme to just kind of see this fear of Sweden's failure in dealing with immigration and how Norway wanted to avoid that at all costs. So I know we've talked a lot about normality and dynamic security, and I thought, this graph shows that there's a huge spike when it comes to immigration, especially in 2022. I think we can all probably guess why 2020 saw a dip. But I think what's interesting is that asking about the dynamic security and the interpersonal relationships between officials and people who were incarcerated is very easy to see. Especially when we are visiting Halden and we see these baked goods being given out and everything like that. But things that stuck out were, for instance, at Halden, they were talking about they needed to renovate the prayer room. And the prayer room, when we looked at it, was, nothing more than like probably a closet with a rug in it. And that was to accommodate basically every religion that needed a prayer room. That's like the small things that I saw where those cultural differences and those ethnic backgrounds, different nationalities can kind of clash with the dynamic security and the interpersonal relationships that Norway tends to bolster so much in its criminal system. Like I said, it seems like deportation is used as a punishment. As the University of Oslo's criminology professor was stating, these practices of deportation have very serious consequences in criminal cases, and a lot of times these deportees are not given the same kind of rights and availability to legal resources that native Norwegians are given. As they described, and as I said before, it's starting to create kind of a two-tier criminal justice system, in which I think is very concerning for a lot of the intellectuals that study the penal system in Norway. Koslingsvinger? Close? All right. So that is the first all-foreigner prison in Norway. I believe it was instituted in like an all-foreigner prison and around, don't quote me on this, I saw 2015 and 2013, so I'm gonna give them 2015 because that feels like less time to have an all-foreign prison. But a lot of the time that we were speaking with people, they talked about the humane conditions and things like that, but I think humane conditions go past just the materialistic standards that are shown. Obviously, my college dorm wasn't as good as some of the cells in Halden, but also having, the experience of being in a place where you are learning a skill, and then once you leave that place, you're immediately sent back to sometimes a country that you didn't even belong to in the first place, is a very scary and dehumanizing experience. I think really when you're looking at what the future holds, especially with the immigration that is bound to continue and a lot of the asylum seekers, I think we can really use how Norway handles that experience to either figure out what they're going to do wrong when dealing with different cultural backgrounds, nationalities, and ethnic backgrounds, or we can find out what they did right and use that in our prison system to kind of negate the objection that we so commonly see about the homogeneous society. I'm going to end it there so we have time for questions.